guys, my name is Josh, and you're going to learn about the Book of World War II. Hi guys, my name is Rebecca Stone, and let's learn about the Battle of World War II.
Hello, my friends. Just like my children just said, we're going to learn about the battles of World War II. And I thought about doing a cute video for this. I also thought about just having you read it, and then I thought, you know what? There's so much cool stuff here. I just wanted to tell you about it myself. So we're not going to learn about every single battle. There's so much cool stuff with World War II that we could learn, and there's no way that we'd have all the time. So I'm just going to go over some of the big ones with you. So first of all, if we were to look at a map, Germany has basically invaded everywhere. Like they've gone to the left or west towards France, and they have invaded France. Hitler's completely taken over. They've also gone and invaded North Africa, as we know, and then they've invaded the Soviet Union. And so it's up to the Allies to turn those invasions back, to get the Germans pushed back into Germany. And yes, I know that there were more Axis powers than just the Germans, and yet at this point they are the primary one that we're focused on with the war in Europe. So the first victory that we see, the first big one that we're going to talk about, belonged to the Soviet Union. The Germans invaded Stalingrad, but the Soviet Union managed to hold them off because they managed to cut off German supplies in the dead of winter, which of course leaves the frozen and starving German troops to surrender. Now, this was a huge loss of men for the Soviet Union. As you can see there, they lost over 1 million soldiers. So their victory did not come without cost. But this was a huge turning point because after this victory, the Soviet Union begins to push the Germans back and move westward towards Germany. Now, at the same time that the Battle of Stalingrad was going on, the United States and Britain launched their own invasion of Axis-controlled North Africa. This was called Operation Torch, and they also achieved victory by May of 1943. So if we look at our map, we see that there's two arrows that now have been turned back around. We've stopped the German invasion into the Soviet Union. We've stopped the German invasion into Africa. Now the only place left is France. So the Allied leaders, they're going to meet again at the Tehran conference. Tehran, by the way, is the capital of Iran. They're going to meet there at the end of 1943, and they all agree that the only thing left is to invade France, to free Western Europe from the Nazis. Now, once again, you might be thinking, wait, isn't France one of the good guys? Yes, they are, but because Hitler has already occupied France, the only option then is to invade France, invade a good country, to push the Nazis out of France. So they call this Operation Overlord. They appoint General Dwight Eisenhower, an American, to command this operation. And under Eisenhower's direction, the Allies gathered a force of nearly 3 million British, American, and Canadian troops. Now, before they actually go and invade, I mean, this is an effort that took 2 years to accomplish, really, when it comes down to it. So by the time they got all of the supplies and all of the troops trained, but they needed an element of surprise. You don't just go and invade France when the Germans are occupying it, especially because the Germans knew that France was important and they were expecting an invasion. So while they're preparing for Operation Overlord, they do what is probably the coolest thing in the history of the military, in my opinion. If you like trick plays, this is the biggest trick play in world history. It's called Operation Fortitude. So let's look at the map. If you're looking at this map and you see, okay, over here is Britain, and here's France, and you've got the English Channel in between, where would you most likely invade? Well, I would invade right up here where there's not that much water, right? It seems like the simplest point. That's what they were banking that the Germans would think too. So at this town called Calais, Eisenhower set up a phantom army This army had its own headquarters, its own equipment. They sent fake army messages that they knew would be easy for the Germans to decipher, and they were ordering their army to attack the French port of Calais. They even stationed Patton there, since the Germans thought that he was the greatest thing in the American army. And if you look at this picture, the equipment was all blow-up equipment. A soldier could hold up that tank with one hand. It was just a giant balloon. So even though the Allied forces were planning on attacking Normandy, the fact that they had everything set up right across the channel from Calais, which I think I said it was in Calais before I made a mistake. It's right across the English Channel from Calais. Because they had everything set up there, Hitler actually kept a huge army in Calais. And that's the spot that he was monitoring and waiting for. It was 150 miles from Normandy, where the Allied forces ended up attacking. Now, the French resistance, the French had this huge underground resistance effort. They played a huge role in helping prepare the way. So, I love this. The military used carrier pigeons dropped from airplanes to get messages across. So, these pigeons would be dropped, attached to a parachute into a pasture. And the next morning, the French owner, the person who owned the pasture, they would find them with a packet of food for the birds, so they fed the birds. And the birds also had an envelope containing instructions and tubes for sending messages that were attached to the pigeon's legs. I mean, how cool is that? Now, the resistance could often cause more problems for the Germans than any military bombers could, because despite the chaos and disorganization, they provided a ton of intelligence to the military. They knew more about their enemy in the area than just about any invading military ever. So this would not have been possible without the French resistance and about the information that they supplied. So before the big day, the American and Canadian and British troops were extremely well fed. They had pie and steaks. They had a lot of downtime. They watched movies, played poker, sports. Some of them even injured themselves on purpose to avoid having to be part of the invasion. This is random. They were issued condoms to be put over the muzzles of their rifles to keep out sand and water. The reason that condoms were helpful is you didn't have to take them off before shooting. The bullet would just go right through them. And they were given little survival kits that looked like buttons, and these buttons were magnetized to become compasses. They had scarves that were printed with the map of France, so they could wear a scarf, and then when they landed, if they got lost, they knew where they were. So just crazy how much they were issued. On the morning of D-Day, they were also given as much as they could eat. And then they were placed on boats that they described as being like a roller coaster, a bucking bronco, and a camel combined. So as you can imagine, between their own nerves and then seasickness, not much food stayed in their bellies. So Operation Overlord, or otherwise known as D-Day, began on June 6, 1944. On that day, Allied soldiers parachuted behind German lines, and thousands upon thousands of soldiers arrived by sea. Now, the Americans and British, they really annoyed each other a lot of times as they worked together in this war, but they each added something important to the team. The American army was the best in the world. Only 2/3 of our draftees made it in. They were smart, they were healthy, they were better educated than most, but they were also very green in battle or inexperienced. Now, this was actually good for a frontal assault like D-Day, where there would be lots of casualties. When it's your first time into battle, you tend to be less cautious. You feel invulnerable. The more experienced soldiers were the ones that would actually collapse on D-Day because they were so scared of what was coming. So in that sense, American soldiers were a huge asset. But the British were an inventive people. They had come up with much of the unique equipment and machinery, and they also had a double-crossing system that allowed them to decode most of Germany's war plans, while convincing Germany that the Germans had the best spy network in the world. They actually had double agents feeding Germans information that was either too late or insignificant. So all of these like double agents or these spies were pretending to be spies for Germany, feeding them lots of irrelevant information while giving the Allies the important information. Such a cool system. So like I said, D-Day was staggering. In just one day and night, 170,000 fighting men and their equipment, including 50,000 vehicles, were transported across 100 miles of open water to land on an enemy-occupied shore. It involved 5,333 ships and almost 11,000 airplanes. But for all of the organization that went behind it, all of the technology and leadership, its success or failure came down to a relatively small number of junior officers and their men. Basically, it rested on the backs of a bunch of 18 to 28-year-olds. If they lacked courage, this would fail. Now, that's what Hitler was banking on. He thought democracy had made us soft in America and Britain, and he figured that the discipline of Germany's totalitarianism would win the day. Now, Hitler knew that the Western Front was a huge threat. He could afford to lose land on the Russian front, but the Western Front was much closer to the German industrial capital, the Rhine. He needed that area for his war-making capabilities. So he said, if the enemy here succeeds in penetrating our defense on the Western Front, consequences of staggering proportions will follow within a short time. So he knew this was important. But the problem with him was that he had gotten himself into a bit of a pickle. He had conquered so much that he couldn't defend it all, and so he had reduced himself to a shortage of men and weapons. He also made really poor defensive decisions because he was so wired to be on the offense. That's all he's done up to this point in the war. Now, Winston Churchill called D-Day the most difficult and complicated operation ever to take place, and I think that's pretty accurate. But despite heavy casualties, the Allies held the beachheads, and after 7 days of fighting, they held on to an 80-mile strip of France. By September, the Allies had freed France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and this good news helped elect Roosevelt to an unprecedented 4th term in November. And then, in October 1944, Americans captured their first German town, causing Hitler to respond with a desperate last-gasp offensive. Now, you remember we had been looking at that map, and they had turned all the arrows back around, so now everybody is basically pushing the Germans back into Germany, and now the Allies have invaded Germany itself. So Hitler freaks out. He orders his troops to break through the Allied lines and try to recapture the Belgian port of Antwerp, in the hopes of maybe disrupting the Allied supply lines. And so in December, German tanks drove 60 miles into Allied territory, creating a bulge in the lines that gave this offensive its name. So if you picture this is Germany, and the Allies are pushing towards Germany, and Hitler's army is going to push back, creating this bulge that you can see. Now, the battle went on for a month. And when it was over, the Germans had been pushed back. So they basically were pushed back to this line. Very little seemed to have changed. However, it was very decisive because the Germans lost 120,000 troops, 600 tanks and assault guns, and 1,600 planes. I mean, those were people and weapons that they could not replace. And from that point on, the Nazis couldn't do anything but retreat.